They paid her £40 to vanish, and she took the money because £40 was the difference between a roof and a ditch. Eleanor Ashford pressed one hand briefly against the stone wall of the coaching inn corridor as the weight of what she had just agreed to settled through her like a stone dropped into still water. Not violently, but completely, reaching every depth before it was done. The money was folded into a cream envelope still warm from Lord Harwick's breast pocket, and Eleanor held it with both hands the way a person holds something they cannot afford to drop. The corridor smelled of tallow and boot leather, and the particular damp cold of a February morning in 1815 that no amount of coal fires entirely solved. Outside the small window at the corridor's end, the road to London stretched pale and frozen, and somewhere along that road, at Ashford Park in Hertfordshire, a man named James Harwick, the 8th Duke of Ashford, was presumably at his breakfast, unaware that in the space of a quarter hour the woman his father had described as a suitable arrangement had been purchased into silence. Eleanor did not look back at the closed parlor door behind her. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a man whose death 4 years earlier had left her the effective manager of everything he had once managed and the legal owner of nothing he had left. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like rescue. She put the envelope into the pocket of her wool cloak, straightened her spine, and walked toward the inn's front door. The morning was bright with the particular cruelty of winter sun that gives light without warmth, and Eleanor walked out into it with the specific posture of a woman who has decided that whatever has just happened is not going to be the last thing that happens to her. She had been staying at Wentworth Hall, the home of her mother's distant cousin, Mrs. Priscilla Finn, for 11 months. In that time she had been called a governess when the subject required a title, and called nothing at all when it did not. She managed the household accounts, organized the quarterly creditor meetings, supervised the linen inventory, wrote Mrs. Finn's correspondence in a hand considerably cleaner than Mrs. Finn's own, and had twice talked the coal merchant out of suspending deliveries. She was paid nothing for this beyond her board, because Mrs. Finn considered the arrangement already more than generous for Eleanor's present circumstances. The Duke of Ashford's name had first appeared in Mrs. Finn's drawing room the previous October, when Mrs. Finn's niece Cecily had come to stay for the season with the express understanding that she was being positioned toward a specific outcome. Cecily was 22, fair-haired, credentialed in the usual accomplishments, and entirely certain of her own arrival. She occupied the best guest room, wore the most recent London fashions, and treated Eleanor with the polished indifference of someone who has accurately assessed the hierarchy and found it confirmed. It was at the Finn household's autumn dinner party that Eleanor had been placed at the far end of the table near the serving door, the position that required her to monitor the kitchen's timing and ensure the courses arrived without collision. The Duke of Ashford had attended this dinner. Eleanor had observed him from the far end of the table with the specific attention of a woman who notices everything and is noticed by no one, and she had thought, setting the thought aside quickly because it was neither useful nor safe, that he moved through the room as though completing an obligation, not as though he wanted anything that was in it. That evening was 6 weeks ago. It felt considerably longer now. Eleanor walked to the end of the coaching inn's front yard and stood at the gate looking at the road. She had £40, a wool cloak, a portmanteau she had packed the previous night without knowing quite why she was packing it, and no particular destination. She had managed worse arrangements. She picked up her list of what came next. She always had a list, even when it existed only in the architecture of her thinking, and she began to work through it. The person being overlooked in any room is often the person keeping the room standing. Eleanor Ashford had been standing in many rooms for 4 years. She was not going to step aside for anyone, but she was also practical enough to know that standing required ground. She needed ground. She had 40 pounds, and she had better find some before winter got any colder. What Eleanor Ashford's mother had called her gift, and what her father had called simply her mind, first made itself useful in the spring of 1811, when she was 22, and her father, Henry Ashford, came home from Bristol with a cough and a creditor letter he had been carrying in his coat for 3 days, because he could not think what to do about it. Eleanor had taken the letter from him, read it twice, asked him 4 questions, and told him what she needed to see. That night she had gone through every account book, every receipt, every promissory note in her father's study. 14 years of imperfect record, keeping some of it in handwriting so deteriorated she had to hold the page to the lamp and read by the light through the paper, and by morning she had a clear picture of exactly how far behind the estate was and exactly which obligations were likely to swallow the others if they were not addressed in a specific order. Her father had died 7 months later in November of 1811. The cough was consumption, a fact the Bristol physician had known and not communicated with sufficient clarity until it was past managing. Eleanor had not been present at the death because the estate was at that moment in the middle of a creditor negotiation she could not interrupt without losing the ground they had gained, and she had calculated with the cold precision that was either her strength or her flaw, depending on who was doing the assessment, that her father would have preferred she stay at the desk. She was probably right. She had never entirely forgiven herself for it. After his death, her cousin Gerald arrived within the fortnight. Gerald Ashford was her father's nephew, the nearest male relation, and the heir by entail to everything the estate legally held, which was the land, the house, and what remained of the farming income. Eleanor held no legal claim. She had spent 7 months building a functional management system, clearing 3 urgent debts, renegotiating the wool merchant's contract to recover approximately £400 annually in margin her father had been unknowingly surrendering for 6 years, and hiring a competent new bailiff after the previous one had been discovered supplementing his income at estate's expense. None of this work belonged to her in any legal sense once Gerald signed the papers. Gerald was not a cruel man. He was simply an incurious one. He kept Eleanor on because she was cheaper than a hired steward, and because the estate ran considerably better when she was doing what she was doing than it had under any previous arrangement. He did not acknowledge this fact in any formal sense. He simply continued to need it. For 3 years, Eleanor managed Ashford Park, the original one, the Ashford Park in Essex, where her family had lived for 4 generations, not the Duke of Ashford's estate in Hertfordshire, which shared the name with the coincidence that had made Mrs. Finn briefly excited in October when she had first heard the Duke's name attached to her dinner invitation. Eleanor balanced the accounts, supervised the tenant farm renewals, argued twice with the local magistrate on matters affecting the estate's drainage rights, and made 29 of the 37 creditor agreements her father had been unable to close. There was one moment in January of 1813 when she had been awake since 3 in the morning working through a particularly complicated wool sale that had gone sideways, and she had set down her pen and pressed both hands flat on the desk and stayed very still for perhaps 4 minutes. She was not going to weep. She had not wept since her father's funeral, and she was not going to begin again in a cold study in Essex with a wool merchant's bad arithmetic in front of her. She was going to pick up the pen and finish the calculation, and then she was going to sleep for 3 hours. And then she was going to write the letter to the wool merchant that would recover what he owed them. She had decided that she was not going to become less than she was. That was the decision. She picked up the pen. She was 24 when Gerald married, and Gerald's new wife had her own views about the appropriate role of female relations. Eleanor was moved from her father's study to a smaller room on the East Wing's second floor, and her management of the estate accounts became unofficial in a way that Gerald seemed not to notice, and his wife made very clear she had noticed. Entirely. By the following spring, Gerald's wife had hired a steward. Eleanor was, by June of 1814, functionally redundant. It was Mrs. Fenn who offered the alternative, which was to say, she wrote a letter suggesting Eleanor might find the arrangement at Wentworth Hall worth considering, and Eleanor, who had no other offers that were not considerably worse, had come to Hertfordshire with one portmanteau and the understanding that she would be useful. She had been useful. She had been extensively, invisibly, thoroughly useful. And then Lord Harwick had walked into the Coaching Inn's private parlor with £40 and a clear expectation that £40 was enough to make Eleanor Ashford's brief intersection with the Ashford dukedom disappear entirely. He was not wrong that she would take the money. He was wrong about what taking it meant. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like welcome. But she had also, over 4 years of managing estates and creditors and wool merchants and men who underestimated her, developed a very specific skill. She knew how to wait for the correct moment, and she knew how to keep records. The Duke of Ashford had, in the 6 weeks between the autumn dinner party and the February morning at the Coaching Inn, done 3 things that Eleanor had observed and filed with the same precision she applied to estate accounts. He had attended the dinner. He had not spoken to Cecily Fenn beyond the requirements of courtesy, and he had, at some point during the dessert course, been found looking at the far end of the table with the specific, focused attention of someone who has just noticed a thing they had not expected to find. Eleanor was not prone to self-deception. She had looked back at him once and then returned to monitoring the kitchen timing, because that was what she was there to do. But she had noticed what she could not have known, because Lord Harwick was careful and the Coaching Inn's private parlor has no windows, was that James Harwick, the Duke of Ashford, had arrived at the same inn 2 hours before his father, and was at that moment sitting in the tap room with a cup of cold tea and a report from a man named Holt, who was the most precise private investigator that money could retain in London in the winter of 1815. The Duke had come to Hertfordshire for the dinner because his solicitor had identified Mrs. Fenn's household as a possible social connection, and because the Duke, who was 31 and had been managing his dukedom since his mother's death 4 years earlier, had by that point in his life developed a considered view of what he actually needed and what the world kept offering him instead. What the world kept offering were women like Cecily Fenn, beautiful, certain, accomplished in the expected ways, and utterly unequipped for the operational reality of managing a ducal estate that had been in moderate but persistent financial difficulty since his father had begun, some years before the Countess of Ashford's death, to regard good judgment as an optional quality in a financial partner. The estate had needed careful, intelligent management for years. The Duke had been providing it himself, working in a manner that left him little patience for social performance and considerable respect for evidence. He had sat at the far end of the Fenn dining table, watching Cecily hold court across the soup course, and had registered, with a precision his own father would have found alarming, that Cecily was not what the estate needed. He had also, at approximately the same moment, registered the woman at the far end of the table near the serving door. She was not performing, that was the first thing. Every person at that table, including himself, was performing something, including him, who was performing the polite fiction of being interested in Cecily Fenn. The woman at the far end was doing something else entirely. She was watching, she was timing. She caught the eye of a footman across the room, with the specific minimal signal of a person who has spent years communicating with household staff without disrupting conversation, and a course that had been arriving late all evening arrived on time thereafter. He did not know her name that night. He found it out the next morning and had retained Holt by noon. Holt's report had arrived 12 days later, and James Harwick, who had trained himself since his mother's death not to want things that were unlikely to resolve in his favor, had read it in his study at Ashford Park with the specific stillness of a man who is very carefully not reacting to something. The report was 47 pages. He had read it twice. Eleanor Ashford, 26. Father Henry Ashford, deceased 1811. Estate management in Essex for 3 years, unacknowledged and unpaid. Account books showing estate recovery of approximately £400 across 4 years of management. Holt had found the numbers in the creditor records and cross-referenced them with the wool merchants' revised contract, the bailiff replacement properly documented in the magistrate's records, the drainage rights negotiation on file, the 29 creditor agreements listed individually with dates and amounts. Holt had even found the wool merchant, who had spoken about her with a grudging precision that carried more weight than a recommendation letter. There was a single handwritten note at the end of Holt's report. Holt was not given to personal commentary. The note read, "The subject is the most competent woman I have investigated in 11 years of this profession. The dukedom would be fortunate to have her management of anything it requires managed." James Harwick had read this sentence 3 times. He had then set the report in his desk drawer and stood at the window of his study looking out at the Ashford Park grounds for a considerable time. His mother, the late Countess of Ashford, had managed this estate with the same invisible precision that Holt's report described. She had done it while his father spent money on enterprises that seemed reasonable and were not, and she had done it without complaint and without acknowledgement, because that was the structure of the world they lived in, and the Countess had been a practical woman. She had died in the winter of 1811, 4 years ago now, and James had found, among her private papers, a set of annotated account ledgers that constituted the most organized and quietly devastating financial record he had ever read. She had known exactly what his father was doing. She had documented it with precision, corrected what she could correct, and absorbed the rest. He had not been able to play the piano since she died. She had taught him on the old instrument in the music room, and it stood now with its lid closed and had stood that way for 4 years. He had come to Mrs. Fenn's dinner party to assess Cecily Fenn, and had instead found evidence of something rarer than he had expected. He had retained Holt. He had read the report. He had made his decision in the manner that was characteristic of him, quietly, privately, completely. He had come to the coaching inn in February intending to speak to Eleanor Ashford. He had arrived 2 hours before his father because he had not told his father he was coming. He was sitting in the tap room, reading Holt's report for the 3rd time in the wan morning light from the window, when he heard his father's voice in the corridor. He did not immediately rise. He listened. The sound from the private parlor was muffled by the door in the distance, but James Harwick had learned, over 4 years of managing a ducal estate with a difficult father, to extract information from insufficient data. He heard his father's voice for approximately 4 minutes, and then he heard the parlor door open, and he heard footsteps in the corridor going toward the inn's front door, and then silence. He sat for a moment longer, his hand flat on Holt's report, and then he rose and went to the corridor. The private parlor was empty. The fire had been lit and was burning efficiently. On the small table near the window there was a tea service that had not been touched, and a cream-colored envelope that had not been left behind by accident, but by someone who wanted Lord Harwick to see that it was gone. There was also on the table beside the tea service a small folded piece of paper that had not been there when Lord Harwick ordered the room, prepared because it had been placed there in the interval between Lord Harwick's departure and whatever came next. James Harwick picked up the paper and unfolded it. It contained 7 words in a handwriting he recognized from the letter Mrs. Finn had used as a reference, which was to say from Eleanor Ashford's own hand. "I will have managed worse than this." The note was not signed. He stood in the empty parlor for a moment. Then he went to the tap room, asked the landlord which direction the woman in the gray wool cloak had, walked, and followed. The grounds of Ashford Park in February were not hospitable, and the Duke had never particularly minded this. He managed the estate year-round, which meant he walked the tenant paths in weather that would have kept most men of his position by the fire, and he had the specific physical ease of a man whose body was accustomed to cold air and uneven ground. He found Eleanor Ashford at the road's edge by the gate, standing with her portmanteau at her feet, and what he identified, from 40 feet of distance, as a woman in the middle of a careful plan. She heard his approach and turned, and her face did its best to offer nothing, which was almost successful. Almost. He had Holt's 47 pages behind him, and he could see the thing that the 47 pages had been unable to adequately quantify, which was that she was someone who had been managing very hard circumstances, with very little assistance for a very long time, and was doing so now, and was not going to let him see exactly how much the last quarter hour had cost her. He did not offer sympathy. He offered the one thing that was actually useful. "Miss Ashford," he said, and his voice had the precise measured quality it always had in a situation that required care. "My father has apparently attempted to remove you from a situation he does not fully understand. I am aware of your work. I have read what Holt put together. I am asking you to come to Ashford Park not as a gesture of restitution, but because I require a specific quality of management, and you are the most qualified person I have found to provide it. The terms will be contracted in writing before you enter the house." Eleanor looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has learned that things which look like rescue sometimes are not. "Your father paid me £40 to disappear," she said. "My father does not manage the estate," the Duke said. "I do." She was quiet for a moment. That was not uncertainty but calculation, which he recognized because it was the same thing he did. "Then I will want to see the contract before I unpack anything," she said. He said, "That is precisely what I intended." She picked up her portmanteau. He did not offer to carry it, because she did not offer to hand it to him. And he had already gathered enough information to know that Eleanor Ashford did not surrender the things without contractual arrangement. They walked back toward the inn together, and neither of them said anything for the length of the walk. But it was not the silence of discomfort. It was the silence of two people who were both, for the first time in a considerable while, in the company of someone who did not require them to explain themselves from the beginning. Ashford Park in Hertfordshire was a larger operation than Eleanor had managed in Essex, and it was in a different kind of difficulty. Not the acute creditor emergency she had navigated for her father, but the slower, more architectural problem of a household that had once had excellent management, and had, since the late Countess's death in 1811, been running on the momentum of her systems without anyone fully understanding how those systems worked, or why they were built the way they were. Eleanor arrived on a Tuesday in February. By Thursday she had read every account book from the previous 3 years. By the following Tuesday she had identified 7 specific structural problems that no one had named because no one had looked at the accounts with both the operational knowledge and the time to trace the discrepancies backward to their sources. The housekeeper, Mrs. Drummond, was a woman of 60 who had served the late Countess for 15 years and who had, in the 4 years since, been holding the household together by memory and habit with the specific quiet desperation of someone who knows the system better than anyone else, but does not have the authority to change what is breaking it. She welcomed Eleanor on the morning of the second day with a warmth that was not performed and not directed at Eleanor's position but at Eleanor's specific competence, which Mrs. Drummond had identified within approximately 45 minutes of watching Eleanor work. The late Countess kept the accounts this way, Mrs. Drummond said, showing Eleanor the particular notation system in the household ledgers that no subsequent steward had understood or preserved. The steward after her wrote everything differently, and the comparison cannot be made now without going back to the original pages. I can make the comparison, Eleanor said. Give me the pages. Mrs. Drummond gave her the pages. Eleanor spent 3 evenings by lamplight in the small morning room that had been designated as her working space, a room adjacent to the Duke's study, which she would understand the significance of later, reconstructing the Countess's notation system and mapping it forward against what the subsequent stewards had recorded. When she had a complete picture, it showed, among other things, that a particular timber merchant in Hertford had been invoicing the estate for deliveries that the estate's own receiving records, cross-referenced with the timber inventory, showed had never fully arrived. The discrepancy went back 14 months. The amount involved was £280. She brought this finding to the Duke on a Thursday morning, not as a social occasion, but as a working matter. She knocked on the study door, and when he said to come in, she set the 3 relevant pages on his desk, side by side, and pointed to the figures. He did not look at her first. He looked at the pages. He followed her finger and read the figures in the order she indicated them, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was processing something. Very still, very precise, a quality of attention that reminded her, uncomfortably and accurately, of herself. 14 months, he said. Yes, the timber merchant is named Graves. He has been invoicing at the full delivery quantity each time. The actual timber in the inventory tells a different story. The Duke leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the particular expression of a man who is calibrating something. 14 months ago was approximately when Steward Bellamy was hired, he said. Yes, Eleanor said, I noticed that. He had been looking at the pages. He was now looking at her. Have you dealt with a vendor fraud of this type before? Once, she said, in Essex. A supplier my father used for 3 years. I recovered the overpayment by presenting the discrepancy to the local magistrate with the full accounting. The supplier made restitution because the alternative was a legal proceeding he could not afford. The Duke was quiet for a moment. Could you do the same here? I would need the last 14 months of timber invoices, the full delivery records, and access to the timber inventory myself to measure the actual current stock, she said. I would also need your authority to approach the magistrate in writing, to establish that I am acting on behalf of the estate. You will have it by this afternoon, he said. He said it simply, the way he said most things, without performance, and it struck Eleanor with the force of something she was not prepared for. This was the first time in 4 years that a man of any authority had given her what she needed to do the work without requiring her to argue for it. First, she said, "Thank you," and picked up her pages, and she pressed one hand briefly against the doorframe as she left, which was not a gesture he saw, or at least she believed he had not seen it. He had seen it. He said nothing. Cecily Finn arrived at Ashford Park the 2nd week of March, accompanied by her mother, because Mrs. Finn had received a social invitation from Lord Harwick that the Duke had not specifically authorized but had also not cancelled, because he had other matters to manage and had assumed it would amount to the usual social obligation. Cecily arrived in a new cream-colored gown with a trimming that was extremely current, and she moved through the Ashford Park drawing-room with the specific authority of a woman who considers herself the natural occupant of a position that has not yet been officially offered. She found Eleanor in the estate library on the morning of the 2nd day, working at the central table with the timber invoices and the delivery records arranged in the specific order that made the comparison possible, and she stood in the library doorway for a moment, looking at Eleanor with an expression that was not anger but was close to it. "I was told Miss Ashford had a position in the estate management," Cecily said. "I had not understood it involved the library." Eleanor did not look up immediately. She made the notation she was in the middle of making, and then she looked up. "It involves wherever the work needs to be done," she said. "The library has adequate light in the morning." "The library," Cecily said, "is where I had intended to practice." "The piano in the library has not been maintained," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Drummond can direct you to the instrument in the music room. It is in considerably better condition." Cecily looked at Eleanor with the clear intention of saying something else, and Eleanor waited with the specific patience of a person who has nothing to apologize for and knows it. After a moment, Cecily said, "You seem very comfortable here for someone in your position," Eleanor said. "I am contracted to this estate. My position is clearly defined. I am in the library because the work I am contracted to perform requires the library this morning." She returned to the invoices. "The music room is on the first floor, east corridor." Cecily left. Eleanor picked up her pen and returned to the figures. She managed worse than this before breakfast on a daily basis. She could manage this. What she had not entirely managed, and what she was managing poorly enough that she was aware of the failure, with this precision she applied to the accounts, was the matter of the Duke himself. Specifically, the evenings. There was a specific pattern that had established itself over the first 3 weeks at Ashford Park that neither of them had designed and neither of them had commented upon. She worked in the morning room until the light failed. He worked in the study until somewhere around 7. In the interval between the light failing and the dinner hour, there was a period of perhaps 40 minutes in which neither of them had a specific obligation, and they had, without discussing it, begun to spend this period in the library. Not together precisely, but in the same room. He read. She organized. They did not always speak. When they did speak, it was about the estate, a creditor arrangement she was considering, a decision about the spring tenant farm renewals, the Graves matter which was progressing toward the magistrate and was going to require careful documentation. These were working conversations, and they were the most satisfying conversations Eleanor had had in 4 years, which was a fact she was not going to examine too carefully, because examining it carefully would require her to acknowledge what it meant, and she was not ready for that. One evening in mid-March, she arrived in the library at the usual time to find that the fire had already been lit and that the Duke was not there yet. She sat in her chair and opened her notes and worked for perhaps 15 minutes in the quiet, and when she heard the door, she did not look up. He came in, and she heard him set something on the table. A book, she thought. And then there was a pause that was slightly longer than usual. "You are wearing your thinking expression," he said. She looked up then. "I was not aware I had one." "It is very like your working expression, but quieter," he said. He sat down across from her. He had come from a meeting with the estate solicitor, and he was not wearing his coat. She noticed this because he always wore his coat in company, and then she noticed that she had noticed it, and she returned to her notes. She said without looking up, "Your cravat has been crooked for the last 40 minutes. There was a pause then. "Has it?" "Since before the solicitor arrived, I believe. I did not wish to mention it in front of Mr. Hartley." She heard him put down his book. She looked up to find him looking at her with the particular expression that she had been cataloging without intending to, and that she could not quite name. He reached up and adjusted the cravat, and she watched him do it, and he was watching her while she watched him, and then she looked back at her notes. He said, "Thank you," she said. "It is a practical matter." Neither of them mentioned it again. But from that evening, the quality of the library's shared silence was slightly different, like a note played at a new pitch in an otherwise familiar piece of music. Lord Harwick arrived at Ashford Park on the 23rd of March, and he did not come to see Eleanor. He came because he had received information from Mrs. Finn that his son was not progressing toward the expected outcome with respect to Cecily, and because Lord Harwick had a very specific understanding of what was appropriate for the Ashford dukedom and what was not, and a woman of Eleanor Ashford's background and position was, in his understanding, not appropriate in any sense that mattered. He found the Duke in the estate study. Eleanor was in the morning room next door, which shared a wall with the study that was thinner than it had any business being, and she could hear the conversation with a clarity she neither sought nor avoided, because there was nowhere else to take her work, and the morning room was where her work was. Lord Harwick said several things about structural considerations. He used the word suitable 4 times in approximately 9 minutes, which Eleanor noted not because she was counting, but because the word registered each time with the specific mechanical quality of something that has been repeated long enough to have lost individual weight. He said that whatever arrangement his son had made with respect to Miss Ashford was presumably the result of a momentary enthusiasm that could be corrected without significant difficulty if addressed promptly. The Duke, from the other side of the wall, said nothing for a long moment after this. Then, he said, in the precise, measured voice that was the same volume as always and carried more weight than anyone shouting, "The estate's accounts are cleaner than they have been in 4 years. A vendor fraud of £280 has been identified and is being processed through the magistrate's office. The spring tenant renewals are complete, documented, and filed. The wool contract has been renegotiated to recover a margin we have been surrendering since Bellamy was hired. This is 3 weeks of work, Father. You will not come into this house and tell me that the person who produced those results in 3 weeks is an unsuitable disruption." Lord Harwick said that the results were not the point. The Duke said that the results were precisely the point, and that the conversation was concluded. Eleanor sat in the morning room with her hand flat on the account book and said nothing and did not move for approximately 4 minutes. She was not going to allow herself to feel anything premature about what she had just heard, because she had been in situations before where things that looked like support had turned out to be temporary and conditional, and she was not going to invest in it until she understood what it meant. She picked up her pen and returned to the accounts. What she did not know was that the Duke, after his father left the study, stood at the window for a long time looking at the Ashford Park grounds in the specific stillness that was his form of very strong feeling. He had heard his mother in that conversation, not Eleanor, not exactly, but the shape of the thing, the specific quality of work done without credit and without acknowledgement that was the structural condition of women of competence in the world. They both lived in, and he was not going to let it happen in his house. He had already decided. He had decided in February at the road's edge by the coaching inn gate. He had simply not yet found the correct moment to say so, and he was not going to say so in the middle of his father's visit, because that was not the correct moment. The moment his father presented itself was not one that Eleanor designed. It was the result of Lord Harwick's behavior at dinner on the evening of the 25th of March, at which Lord Harwick, Cecily Finn, Mrs. Finn, Eleanor, the Duke, and a small number of local families were present, and at which Lord Harwick, in the course of a conversation about the estate's management, made the specific choice to credit Steward Bellamy, who had been under investigation for the timber fraud for 3 weeks, with the estate's recent financial improvements. Eleanor set down her fork. She picked it up again. She said nothing. Cecily said, with the bright particular confidence of someone who believes the room is aligned with her, "I understand the estate management was in some difficulty before the new steward arrived." Eleanor said, quietly and precisely, "The estate management has been under my direction since the 14th of February. The specific improvements Lord Harwick mentions are documented in the account books in the morning room. Steward Bellamy is currently the subject of a magistrate's inquiry into a £280 vendor fraud he failed to identify during 14 months of service. I identified it in my first week. The table was quiet in the specific way that tables become quiet when something has just happened that no one was expecting. Lord Harwick looked at Eleanor with an expression that she could not entirely read. Cecily said nothing. Mrs. Fenn's cup made a small sound against its saucer. The Duke said, from the head of the table, "Miss Ashford is entirely correct." That was all he said. It was enough. The table recalibrated. 6 days later, Eleanor received a formal written request from the Hertfordshire Agricultural Society, channeled through a man named Mr. Edward White, who was a retired county solicitor and a long-standing acquaintance of the Ashford estate, to present her methodology for the tenant farm renewal contracts to a meeting of the Society's council. The request had been initiated, she later discovered, by a letter from the Duke of Ashford to Mr. White that described her work in terms that were precise and factual, and that Mr. White told her, when he came to the house to discuss the invitation, were the warmest he had ever received from James Harwick in 30 years of acquaintance. Mr. White was 71, with a solicitor's careful eyes and a directness that Eleanor found immediately reliable. He sat across from her in the morning room and read through her tenant renewal documentation without preamble. And when he finished, he set the papers down and said, "These are excellent. Will you present them yourself?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Good," he said. "The council does not expect a woman. Bring the evidence and let it speak. I will be in the room." She said, "That is all I need." The meeting of the Hertfordshire Agricultural Society's council was held on the 14th of April in the council chamber of the county seat, a room that held approximately 40 men and 2 women, one of whom was the wife of a council member who attended every meeting and kept her own account of the proceedings, and one of whom was Eleanor. She had dressed in the best gown she owned, which was not the most fashionable gown in the room, and was very clean and very well pressed, and she carried a leather document case that contained the timber fraud records, the tenant renewal contracts, the wool merchant renegotiation documentation, the annotated account ledgers, and Holt's original 47-page report, which the Duke had given her the previous week, with a note on the first page in his own handwriting that said simply, "For your use, should it be required." The council chamber was formal and cold, and the 40 men in it were mostly not looking at her. Lord Harwick was present. She had not known he would be. She registered his presence in the room the way she registered everything, which was completely and without visible reaction, and she took her seat. Mr. White opened the presentation. He was brief, factual, and precise, which Eleanor valued. He introduced her by name and position, and said that she had been contracted to the Ashford estate in Hertfordshire since February and had produced documented operational results worth hearing. And then he sat down. Eleanor rose. She opened the document case. She set the accounts on the table in the order that made the comparative analysis possible. The Countess's original notation system, the steward's years, her own reconstructed bridge between them, and she began with the timber fraud because it was the most concrete, and because it had already been confirmed by the magistrate's office, and because she knew that the council would be more willing to follow the rest of what she had to say once they had seen a single thing they could verify. She did not argue, she did not plead, she presented. She pointed to figures and named them. She explained the notation system she had reconstructed and what it showed. She showed the wool merchant comparison with specific pound amounts for each of the 6 years the previous contract had been in place, and the specific amount recovered per year under the renegotiated terms. She showed the tenant renewal contracts, which used a format she had developed, that tied the renewal term to the farm's documented productivity rather than to a fixed historical rate. And she explained the long-term financials logic of this approach in terms that any man in the room who ran an estate could follow without difficulty. She spoke for 22 minutes. The room was quiet in a way that was different from the dinner table quiet. This was the quiet of a room that has received more information than it expected and is still processing the weight of it. At the end of the 22 minutes, a council member on the left side of the chamber asked her a question about the wool merchant's contract structure. She answered it. Another asked about the timber fraud magistrate's timeline. She answered that. A third asked whether the tenant productivity format could be applied to estates outside the specific agricultural conditions of Hertfordshire. She answered that too, with 3 specific scenarios, and referenced the page in the documentation where each scenario was worked through. The room did not erupt. There was a long suspended moment, and then there was the specific quality of sound that happens when 40 people begin to speak to each other quietly and urgently because what they have heard requires immediate private discussion. Lord Harwick had not spoken. Eleanor did not look at him. She was closing the document case with the specific precision of a woman who has done what she came to do and is not going to wait to be thanked for it. The Duke had entered the chamber at the 12-minute mark. She had heard the door and registered his presence. Without looking away from the accounts she was presenting, he had taken a position at the back of the room, standing in his dark coat, with the quiet authority that meant he had come deliberately and was not going to be confused with someone who had arrived by accident. When she closed the document case, she heard movement at the back of the room. She looked up. The Duke was walking toward the front of the chamber, through the rows of seated council members, and the specific quality of his movement, deliberate, unhurried, carrying the weight of someone who has made a decision and is in the process of acting on it, made the room go quiet again. He stopped beside her chair. He was the Duke of Ashford, and the room knew it, and in front of 40 men and 2 women and his own father, he took Eleanor Ashford's hand, her bare hand, because she had removed her gloves to handle the documents, and he brought it to his lips and held it there for a moment that was not hurried and not performed, but completely simply real. He said, looking not at the room but at her, "I owe you a more private conversation, but I wanted this room to see it." The chamber was very still. Eleanor looked at him with the particular expression of a person who has been surprised by something they were not entirely unprepared for, and she thought, with the specific precision that was either her strength or her flaw, depending on who was doing the assessment, that this was probably the moment she had been waiting for since she was 22 years old. Working through her father's accounts at 3 in the morning and deciding that she was not going to become less than she was, she said quietly, "I will hold you to the private conversation." Lord Harwick, seated 3 rows back, did not speak and did not rise. He looked at his son's hand on Eleanor's hand, and something in his face shifted in the particular way of a man who has been looking at a thing from the wrong angle for a long time and has just, without particular pleasure and without any ability to revise what he has cost in the process, seen it correctly. He did not say anything. He pressed his hands together on the table in front of him, and he looked at the account she had laid out, still visible on the table, and he read the figures. After the council members had shaken Eleanor's hand with a sincerity that 3 months earlier they would not have believed they were capable of directing toward a woman in her position. After Mr. White had stood with her in the corridor and said, with the dry precision of a man who has been right about a great many things in 71 years, "I told you the evidence would speak," after Cecily Finn, who had been informed of the day's events by her mother's note by the following morning and had written a response so carefully worded it contained nothing that could be used against her. had retreated from Ashford Park to London with her accomplishments intact and her certainty significantly modified. After all of this, the Duke came to find Eleanor in the morning room on the evening of the 15th of April. She was at her desk. She was always at her desk. He knocked, which he did not always do, and she said to come in, and he came in and closed the door behind him, which he also did not always do. She set down her pen. He remained standing for a moment with the specific quality of a man who has something to say, and is going to say it correctly, and is gathering the precision to do so. "I should have come to you first," he said, "before my father arrived before the council meeting. I had decided in February. I should have told you in February." She waited. She was good at waiting. He said, "I am asking you to marry me, not because it resolves the question of the estate's management, though you would manage it better than anyone I have found, not because it is the appropriate response to the chamber performance, though what you did today was." He stopped, and she saw him choose a word carefully in the way he chose everything. "Extraordinary. I am asking because you are the only person I have been in a room with in 4 years who did not require me to explain myself, and because you straightened my cravat without being asked, and because you knew the timber fraud before I could have seen it, and because when my father said what he said at dinner, you said what was true without saying more than what was true, and because—" Another pause, this one longer. "Because I have been standing in the corridor outside this room for 3 evenings, wondering how to say this, and I am not going to stand in it a 4th. Eleanor was quiet. She thought about it, completely the way she thought about everything that mattered. She thought about the coaching in corridor and the 40 pounds and the 7 words she had left on the parlor table. She thought about the accounts at 3 in the morning and her father's study and the pen she had picked up instead of putting down. She thought about this room, this desk, the Duke at the window of his study without his coat, the library at 7 o'clock in the evening when neither of them had anywhere else they needed to be. She said yes. He did not move immediately, and she understood this was the same quality she had herself. The careful adjustment to the fact that something decided has become something real. Then he crossed the room and he sat in the chair across from her desk, the chair where Mr. White had sat, where Mrs. Drummond sat when they went through the linen inventory, and he looked at her in the particular way she had been cataloging without meaning to catalog, and she looked back. "The estate contract," she said. "Does it need revision?" He almost smiled. "I suspect you will revise it regardless of what I say." "I will revise it so the terms are equitable," she said. "Both parties should have what they are owed." "Yes," he said, "they should." She picked up her pen. He stayed in the chair. The fire was burning well, and the evening was not as cold as February had been, and they remained like that for some time, her at her desk and him watching her work in the particular comfortable silence of two people who have found, somewhat against the structural odds of the world they live in, the thing they had each been looking for. They married in June of 1815 in the parish church at Ashford in a ceremony attended by 43 people, including Mr. Edward White, who stood as the Duke's witness, Mrs. Drummond, who arrived early and arranged the flowers with a precision that would have satisfied Eleanor herself, and a young woman named Anne Holt, who had come to Ashford Park as a lady's maid in March, and who had, in the 7 weeks since, become the first person in the house to call Eleanor by her given name, which she did with the specific warmth of someone who has decided that formality is a tool and not a value. Lord Harwick attended. He sat in the second pew, not the first, because he had not been asked to be in the first pew, and he did not claim it. At the moment the vicar pronounced them married, he was looking at his hands. Afterward, in the churchyard, he came to Eleanor and stood in front of her for a moment in which he seemed to be deciding something, and then he said, "The accounts you presented were well organized." He said this as though it cost him something, and it did. Eleanor received it as what it was, Not an apology, not quite, but as close as he was capable of coming, and closer than she had expected. She said, "Thank you, Lord Harwick," and left it at that. The annotated account ledgers that Eleanor developed at Ashford Park over the following 3 years were adopted with minor regional adjustments by 11 neighboring estates in Hertfordshire. She compiled them into a single reference document in 1817, which Mr. White presented to the County Agricultural Society on her behalf, and which the society endorsed at its autumn meeting by a vote of 29 to 4, a majority that would have been impossible, as several council members privately acknowledged, without the April 1815 presentation. Estates that used Eleanor's tenant renewal format reported, on average, a 15% improvement in renewal completion rates over the following 2 farming years. The Duke had the piano in the music room tuned in August of 1815. For the first time since his mother's death, he had not mentioned it. Eleanor had noticed the tuner's visit and had not mentioned it either. On the evening after the tuner came, she went to the music room after dinner, opened the lid, and played the first movement of a Haydn sonata she had learned as a girl. He appeared in the doorway after perhaps 8 minutes and listened without speaking until she finished. She played his mother's favorite composition next. She had found the sheet music in the Countess's papers, which the Duke had given her access to in April, and she had been studying it quietly for a month. When she played it, she heard him move, and she did not look away from the keys. When it was finished, there was a moment in the room that had no appropriate words in it, and Eleanor played the opening again, softly, giving the silence somewhere to go. Later, she would not remember who moved first. She thought it was probably both of them simultaneously, which would be exactly like them. Their daughter was born in April of 1817, and they named her Catherine after the late Countess. She had her father's precise dark eyes and her mother's particular quality of attention, and she was observed at 14 months to be rearranging the objects on her mother's desk with the specific deliberate focus of someone who is conducting an organizational project and does not require assistance. Eleanor watched her do this and felt something in the region of her chest that she could not have catalogued if she tried. By 1818, the Ashford estate accounts showed a recovery of approximately £300 over 3 years of Eleanor's management, a figure that excluded the timber fraud restitution, which had been settled by the magistrate at the full £280, and the renegotiated wool contract margin, which had compounded. The estate was not wealthy in the extravagant sense. It was functional, documented, and sound in the way that things built carefully and maintained honestly are sound. Not showy, but entirely reliable. Catherine had learned to walk by November and spent the better part of December escaping the nursery and making her way to whatever room her mother was working in, which Mrs. Drummond thought was charming, and the nursemaid thought was an organizational problem, and Eleanor thought was simply accurate. The child knew where the work was. On an evening in December of 1818, Eleanor was at her desk in the morning room with the quarterly accounts open in front of her, and Catherine was asleep upstairs, and Mrs. Drummond had retired, and the house was quiet in the specific warm way of a house that has been properly managed and is full of heat in every room that needs it. The Duke came to the doorway of the morning room. He still knocked. He had always knocked, and she said to come in. And he came in and did not sit in the chair across from her desk, but stood at the window for a moment, looking out at the December grounds. She finished the figure she was working on. Then she looked up. He was watching her in the particular way that she had long since stopped cataloging, and simply received, the way you receive something that has become the fixed architecture of your days. Quietly, without surprise, with the specific gratitude of knowing it will be there tomorrow. She said, "The quarterly figures are good." He said, "I know. I read them this morning," she said. "Then you did not come in for the figures." He turned from the window. "No," he said. "I came in because Catherine has made another attempt on the nursery door, and Mrs. Drummond is pretending not to notice. And because the fire in here is better than the fire in my study. And because stopped in the way he stopped when he was choosing something." "Precisely. Because you are here." Eleanor set down her pen. She thought about this for a moment, in the manner she thought about everything that was worth thinking about completely. Then she rose from the desk and crossed the room and stood beside him at the window, and they looked out together at the dark December grounds of Ashford Park, which were well managed and carefully maintained and entirely, solidly theirs. She had brought everything she had, and she had put it to work. The world had finally looked,